That's it. Good afternoon. Welcome to KAUST Live. We're coming to you from the Winter Enrichment Program. Today with us is Todd Nims. He's a filmmaker, producer, and he's here to screen for a special screening of his film Jude. Todd, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
I appreciate you guys having me.
Definitely. So, tell us a little bit about Jude and what started you down the path of making that film.
Jude is, I think, something different for audiences here, not just in Saudi Arabia, I think internationally. It's a film that I've produced along with Abdullah Ayaf from the Kingsley Center for World Culture, and it took it was a long time in the making. Actually, we were when I was first kind of working with the Abdullah Kingsley Center for World Culture, ITHRA. There was talk about doing a movie, and there was something kind of big, very cinematic. That went on for quite a while, and it wasn't until Abdullah and I kind of got together, really started thinking about what would be something that would really match with kind of the center's, I think, values and what they're looking to kind of put out in the world. And that's when we had a big discussion, and I think a lot of the movies that at least this film's inspired from, I think they're not for everybody, but these kind of cultural, high art concept films, for instance, Samsara, Baraka, Kiano Squatsi, and these are all films that don't have any words and are little slices of humanity, and they kind of tell a bigger picture, I think, of the human story. And that's what we kind of put together and came up with a concept for and an outline. And from there, we began to we moved forward with it. I don't know, I'm sure a lot of people aren't really familiar with the concept of Jude, because we really haven't done much to let people know about it, because we're now really pushing it into festivals. So. This is kind of a unique chance for people, I think, to get a first look. It's a very unique, we're very happy to have KAUST kind of take a look at it, and the people here for it. But I think that, I think you'll be a handful of people that'll be there tonight will be some of the only people that have really seen the movie so far before it kind of goes. We'd like to see it out there in cultural centers and other places. But a little bit about the film, just so people understand, I guess, what the concept is. Pre-Islam and from the desert, there's been a form of poetry called, and I'm going to say it wrong because my pronunciation isn't going to be perfect, but the caseta, and which is an Arabic form of poetry. And it was developed over a long period of time, and there's a lot of very famous casetas. In fact, in the Kaaba, which is where Abraham almost did the sacrifice, there was 7 of these poems that were nailed to the Kaaba, and they're called. The translation in English is the hanging ones. And if you study any of these poems, and there's of course much more than 7 poems. There's thousands of these. Saudis or Arabs in general, especially Khaliji Arabs, are known for their poetry and love of poetry. And the caseta was definitely the first form that developed over time of this poem, and it has a certain structure. This kind of poetry, it's actually not unlike a 3-act. I mean, it is more or less a 3-act structure, but every act has its own character that generally happens. So what we did is, this film, and our tagline for it is an ancient poem for modern times, because it's a bit of this, it goes through this 3-act structure that you see or that you read about in the caseta poems. And the poem, if you will, is a poem about the actual poem. The structure is like that, but the poem itself is really the story of the life. It's the life cycle in reverse. It goes from death to birth. And the word Jude, how that comes into it. Jude is a movie that, a word that in Arabic means kind of generosity, but in the face of scarcity, kind of generosity when we don't really have things to give. So in the context of the life cycle, it's kind of asking us in a way to it's kind of asking you to look under the surface of everyday life and sort of see how life itself is giving, even when sometimes it seems like it's taking away. So I think is a very beautiful concept.
Yeah. Does this poem take the form only of visuals and sound, or is there a narrator that goes throughout the film?
Well, as you'll find out tonight, so there's no words in the movie, so no narration, no nothing. There are a few at the beginning and at the very end. There's a couple words that are in Arabic, but they're sort of not being spoken directly, and they're more of almost a. I don't want to give anything away, but they have to do with life and death. Let's put it that way. And I think the film opens actually with a pretty shocking scene that I hope that people will. I think it grabs your attention right away. But no words. So because of that, we really focused a lot, not just on the visuals, because the visuals are doing the talking, which were so important in the way we did the film. In fact. We found a director whose history has a very strong visual history. Some of his first films, short films, went to Cannes, and they were these very visual, and all they had was music to them, which was these kind of films, when you watch it, and they're kind of make up the sound through a bunch of people different making noises, like whether it's in a factory or in a coffee shop or something like that. So. That was the second. So it wasn't just a strong visual, but it was also his ear. He had a very strong music foundation, and in fact, he has his own music production company, which has done a lot of well-known films, cinematic films. Mm-hmm. So the music was really the key to me. The audio in any film. A lot of people don't realize this if you're not in filmmaking, but and even filmmakers sometimes don't realize this. But the more you work in movies, the more you realize that the sound is actually almost more important. It is, to me, it is more important than the visuals. And I say that because imagine you have everyone in a room, and they're sitting there watching a movie, and if you were to show them, the worst. Yeah, a wonderful picture, just beautiful, the best visuals possible. But the audio is not done well. The voices are scratchy, or the music's just so. They're not going to feel it's professional. Now, if you have the opposite, where you have something like you see it all the time with documentaries that have really good sound, like or Ken Burns, for instance, a lot of that's just photos. But the music and the way the professional level of the recording and everything is so good that people will automatically say, "Oh, this is well done." And a lot of that's the audio that they hear. It's not what they see, because sometimes you're seeing scratchy, horrible, but it's the audio.
Right.
And this was so powerful for this film. We worked really hard on the music. It's all original soundtrack. The composer we found, which was also a big search. He's the composer for the last year there was I guess it was 2 years ago now, 2016, but the last Oscars, he's the composer for Thebe, which was nominated for an Oscar last year, which was a really good film that's also out of the Gulf, and a beautiful story. If you haven't seen it, you should definitely see it. So we worked with him, and the way we actually developed the soundtrack was, and the film itself too, was to think first about the music and the movements that we were going to have, and then find stories that sort of fit we had put together, Abdul and I, an arc, a story arc, and that but then fill it with these stories of kind of all over. We wanted to do everything all over the kingdom, and but music was a central part of this with the movements. And Andrew and Jerry really. Andrew was the director. Andrew Lancaster is the director, and Jerry Lane is the composer. They really kind of came in, and especially Andrew worked on that kind of putting that music, the movements, and pushing that, putting that together, so we could kind of start tagging stories to those movements. And then we actually started working on the music itself. That was something we didn't start when the film was done. We started it as we were doing the movie and shooting, which we shot. I mean, it was a lot of shit. We did this movie took over. I mean, 2.5 years to do, but the actual shooting itself took about 9 months or more with some breaks. But when we started out with doing this, we also started recording at the same time. We'd record local musicians. On set, we'd record people doing poetry and these kind of things. And so we started throwing in a lot of these. Because the way the poems are done, they're kind of they're not poems. They're sort of sung. So there's a little bit of that in there, not much. Just you'll hear a little in there. But we did also, and then we did a big session in Jeddah actually, at a place called Libra Productions, which with Dia Al-Ayouni, which they're fantastic. We worked and did a bunch of local Saudi musicians, recorded all different kinds of instruments. Once we had all that. We took all that back to London, and we did a big recording with the London Contemporary Orchestra, and which I think just put the cherry on top, so to speak, of so you have everything in there from just this raw, I don't know if you're familiar with the different Saudi instruments, but you have the rababa, or the the ouds, and so you just have like maybe a rababa and someone singing, all the way up through electronic music, because again, Andrew actually came in on that strong, which was kind of developed this kind of more contemporary, almost some house in there a little bit, and very kind of moving, and then you get just a full usual orchestra, full-blown, sort of more cinematic, what people are used to, music in there, and there's a blend all between. I mean, you go up and down, and it really helps us to I think tell that story that we're trying to tell in the film.
Do you feel like these are going to be visuals? These are going to be images that are commonly evoked of Saudi Arabia, or do you think this is going to break down some barriers in people's minds about the geography, the people?
Well,
culture,
it's funny.
etc.?
I think there's two sides to that. Short answer is no. For the most part, people will not find these, I think, typical. And when I say people, I don't mean just internationally. I think Saudis as well. Dylan and I worked really hard, and the team, we all worked really hard in developing something that was, it's a story of, it's a human story, it's a story of life and death, but in that story you really see the full spectrum of humanity, and the kingdom, fortunately, Saudi is a great place to do that, because I've been on and off in Saudi a lot of my life, but Saudi's the 13th largest country in the world. It's a gigantic place. Most Saudis have never seen, I think, probably this much of what the country has to offer. There's so much, especially in terms of not just biodiversity, which is a huge thing. I think people realize Saudi's not just desert. I mean, there's all these. I don't want to. Let me not give too much away, but you will definitely see a lot of varied landscapes, but also people. Diversity of people. You don't just see. Well, of course, you do see what I think is what is kind of promoted as the typical Saudi, which is the thobe with the checkered shmag, and done certain way, and then the abaya, the black abaya for women. But I think a lot of this, there's so much difference and diversity throughout the entire kingdom in that respect. And while that wasn't necessarily the goal of the film at all, it's not to show Saudi Arabia or anything like that. I think that's a great byproduct that happened of the film, I think, and through the story. And I definitely think that'll be a response that people will go. I mean, when we screened it in London, we did some, because this film hasn't gone out, we're waiting to go to festivals with it, but we did do some test screenings in London. And one of the biggest responses we got was that people were, so is this Saudi Arabia? Like, they couldn't believe that was even, and of course I don't expect an international audience to know anything about, because no one can really travel Arabia. I mean, I know it's changing now. We're going to have tourism is opening up and all these kind of things. But,
right.
So I fully expect anything you show of Saudi to kind of surprise people for their national audience. But I think the real surprise will be, from Saudis, and I'm hoping when people see it tonight that I'm really looking forward to hearing, I hope, from some Saudis about that aspect of what they feel on it.
Right. Born a King, you guys are finishing up production on that. So that is a talkie film, I believe, right? So get into working on that and the differences between Jude and...
Okay, so Born a King is it's a totally different. So Born a King is a film we just wrapped shooting on November 16th. It's a big film. It's a 20 million euro budget film, kind of like you'd have... it's very similar to the King's Speech, actually. The story is the story of a 13-year-old boy who is sent to England, the world superpower at the time. It's a period piece. It takes place in 1919. But sent to England at the time, and where the fate of his country basically hangs in the balance of this 13-year-old kid. And of course, that 13-year-old boy is Faisal, who later became King Faisal, which many people around the world know for, I think, all he kind of did for. I mean, he was a real mover and shaker of his time. I mean, from pan-Islam to all the reforms he made in Saudi with modernization and. Of course, the oil embargo was assassinated. We don't go into any of those aspects. It's literally just this story, really short time period of we sort of grab out, a lot like the King's Speech in that respect, where it's not the story of King George. It's just this guy who has a speech impediment. Same thing with this. It's just this kind of boy who's sent away by his father to do this thing for the country, it could have, Saudi might have been a totally different place had he not been successful, or maybe not even, who knows, may not have been around. It was a very harrowing mission that he went on. And there's a lot of, I think, interesting, I think people are going to be really fascinated with, because it's the same time of Lawrence of Arabia. In fact, Lawrence of Arabia was busy promoting Sharif Hussein of the Hashemites is about to be king of Arabia. And Philby, the equivalent of Lawrence of Arabia for Saudi, kind of rushed here basically and said, hey, we got to get you to England, and trying to get the king, well, it was really the kind of the chief of the Nejd at the time, but King Abdulaziz, to come to England. And he could, there's no way. He was in the middle of doing all these, trying to unite the kingdom, and his oldest son, Turkey, had just died, so he was leading his army, so he's basically forced Philby to take this 13-year-old kid with him, his other son. And I think Kilby, begrudgingly kind of did it, but I think he was surprised because as soon as he hit the floor, Faisal kind of got all this press, and people are, oh, who's this charming 13-year-old boy? And from there, that's when him and Lawrence of Arabia kind of start getting into it, and there's this kind of battle going on, and then it's a really interesting. I think people are going to really enjoy it. So I'm excited for people to see that. We're in post. We're going to be done in March. We should be with a final cut, and we feel looks like it. That, of course, along with Jude as well, might be something that we see in Saudi cinemas here coming up very soon, shortly, which is of course very exciting for us. But definitely not just Saudi cinemas. These are both films that we want to see international distribution for, and we've already got a lot of things in place for that, especially with Born a King, but with Jude as well, we've got a lot of things lining up.
Right. So let's go back to the beginning then. So you grew up in Dhahran, I believe.
Yeah, so I'm obviously American, but I was born in Saudi Arabia. Yeah. And
then the progression from there. Tell us how filmmaking became your thing. And
well, I think they have a term for people that are expats that grow up overseas. It's third culture kid. And they have an even more specific term for people that are born with an Aramco Bratz, which I made the movie for, actually. I think that one thing growing up between worlds like that is you become a storyteller. You're always traveling, I think, and having to tell your family back home or other people about trying to explain things to people and give them a little bit of your life and let them in on your life. And so I think it forces you to become a natural storyteller. I've always loved storytelling. So my family also, I feel, a lot of my family are very good storytellers. So I think we kind of all share that in common. And so for me, kind of growing up in Arabia, and then we left when I was 5. I lived by NASA Space Center in Houston, and then came back again when I was 10. And that was right when the Gulf War broke out. So, I mean, you can imagine there were scuds and gas masks and all. So we evacuated for a little, my brother, mother, and I, which to me, actually, doing that as a kid, kind of going between this very exotic, the kingdom, and then leaving, and then coming back, and then there's this big war that's bigger than you and even where you are. That is when I really, during that process, I was only 10 at the time when I came back, but I remember at those times really starting to kind of view the world in a very big way and understanding how stories start moving people. In fact, there's one specific thing that happened during the Gulf War that actually really got me. There was this, so there used to be this song during that time, and I doubt you'll have to tell me if you know this, but there was this song it was Madonna and Mike Tyson and Will Smith. All these people were kind of involved in it, and it was "Stand tall, stand proud, voices that care are crying out." That's my music. But it was this song called "Stand Tall, Stand Proud." Are you familiar?
Mike Tyson was in this? I mean, that's the most surprising part to me.
It blew my mind, too. They got all these, it was some production that was done, probably out in LA, and they got all these kind of famous people of the time, and they sang, this together, but it was a song that was kind of put together for the war, right? It was called "Stand Tall, Stand Proud."
Right.
And I remember when we were over here before we evacuated, we would go and we'd have the soldiers over all the time, and for dinners and things like that. And then we'd also go out to the camp. So we went out to KAUST once, it's a little town on the border between Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. And I remember we would always sing this song. We loved this song, because it was kind of like what we'd hear all the time. And I remember this is like Dan Rather and all these different reporters were always down here all the time. And we were up there with the soldiers, and I remember they put this song on television screens, and they blasted it, and all these, we were side by side with these soldiers. We all started singing along to it. And I mean, there were some guys that what they did is they intercut it with some people, some of the mothers and fathers from the soldiers, and they were coming in and saying like, "Johnny, we're really, we miss you, and we're proud, that you're out here," and these other little things. So there was some soldiers that were crying and really breaking down, and kind of, they missed their families and everything. I remember looking at that and going, man, I was just really moved. So that was one thing. And then the flip side of that was when I actually did evacuate and I got to the States. I came to a place called Victoria, Texas, where my grandmother was at the time. It's kind of between Austin and San Antonio and Houston. And it's pretty, it's not your city, but it's like it was a going affair at the time. I mean, it's not the smallest town either.
Right.
So, but when I got there, I remember people, "Oh, Saudi Arabia, what's that?" And and I said, "Yeah, the Gulf War, stand tall, stand proud." And they looked at me like I was crazy. They had no idea what I was talking about. They never even heard the song.
Yeah.
And that's, to me, I was sort of like, for me, that was a huge shock, because I kind of realized how, in a way, I could understand what was going on in the sense of, you have to kind of have these stories and things like and songs, things that to move people. I also felt really bad for the soldiers I felt were going to come back and get that response, because I thought, God, if I came back and I was fighting and I all of a sudden, I had this response, people were like, "What are you talking about?" I go, "Oh man," you'd feel almost like, you felt like, because when you're over there, you felt like everyone was supporting you,
right,
and everyone knew what was going on. So I think that just kind of helped me to that's when I sort of got out and started seeing the world in a bigger picture, in the stories that we tell in our everyday lives, and the movements that happen in the world, and how they move people, and the passion behind it. And you know, and lucky for me, growing up during the time I've been sort of one of these. I'm from the generation that has been between. When I was young, I didn't have a cell phone. The internet wasn't a huge thing. But then as I sort of grew up, that became a thing with the internet and the phones. And then part of that was digital cameras. You know, so we used to do little digital shooting and movies and things like that during that time, and for school projects and other things. So I think that also really helped me to start, I think, telling stories. And then when I graduated college, I went to CU Boulder, and I just went to LA with no money. I couldn't. I only was able to stay there about 2 weeks, and I had to take a job selling hand lotion for an LA company in Chicago for about 3 or 4 months. And I came back and signed up with Universal Casting and kind of got on sets. But I would, you know, at night I would, you know, go on the internet and learn everything everything I could, and then I would go back to set and I would be more knowledgeable. I'd talk to people, and then I don't know if I should say this, but I was hacked all the programs for Apple. You know, back like the Final Cut and all these different things back in the day. You might have to delete that, but I would sort of teach myself editing, all different things at night, and then you know, between that and being on actual huge sets, it gave me a really good idea of the in between, and that was when the digital revolution was in full swing. It was around 2003 or 2005, 8. That's when I was in LA, and during that time, I connected with a couple other Aramco Bratz, people that grew up this way, and we started working on a film that was kind of, you know, this is the what I alluded to earlier, this movie about the Aramco Bratz, Home, the Aramco Bratz story. And that, I think, was, to me, the reason there was a lot of reasons behind that. For me in filmmaking, I knew I didn't want to just stick in LA and kind of always be working. No one, I think, is ever going to just come to you and say, hey, produce this or direct this for me. I think they do that if you jump and take the leap of just doing it. I mean, if you wait around for someone to give you permission. So when I saw that opportunity to tell a story like that I think is a powerful story, especially given the whole, you know, the backlash that was going on from 9/11. People used to come up to me and say, when I say, yeah, I'm American, but I was born in Saudi, they'd say, well, what's Saudi Arabia like? But after that, they started being like, well, Saudi's like this. They would tell me, and I go, you don't even know. I mean, I'm the one who lived there. So this was kind of like a way to tell a story that were kind of it's sort of Saudi through the eyes of expats that grew up there. And I think that was really an important story to tell at the time, because for Americans, it was like hearing from people, you know, the horse's mouth, so to speak. And I think that made a big difference. We did a big premiere in Hollywood, and I remember I was with one of the executive producers for one of De Niro's films, and she was bawling, you know, next to me, crying. I had no idea, you know, the film was, you know, the people were Americans were even over there. So that was a really big, I think it made an impact on that side. This flip side was Saudis. When we did a premiere in Riyadh, I was graciously invited by His Royal Highness Prince Turki Al Faisal out to Riyadh and to screen it. And that was a huge thing there too, because Saudis, I realized, hadn't really heard from, especially in that part of the country, hadn't really heard from expats about their lives over there and how much the emotional connection they had to the country. And so that was, I think, mind-opening. And then for actual people that grew up over there, Aramco Bratz, I think it was a big thing, because you grow up your whole life as, again, kind of being a third culture kid, and never being able to describe that experience versus sit someone down and let them see that, 90 minutes of that, and get a feel for it and get it, I get it, I think was a really cathartic thing for most Aramco Bratz. So that, I think, launched me into realizing I had to continue to move and do this, but also that there are a lot of stories that need to be told about Saudi and my personal connection to it. I feel like I have a unique position to be able to take stories and bring them to the wider world from here. And I was kind of tenacious, and I decided I was going to stick around. I didn't have any money at the time. I went about, because that was an independently done film. I mean, I kind of crowdsourced that film before Kickstarter and all these things were ever done. We made the trailer, and then we pre-sold DVDs online. But I was in huge, I mean, it was like 20 grand in debt, I think, by the time I was out here, and was running around, but I started making all these I started working as doing the underground stand-up comedy, bringing comedians here, and then did some of the first casting calls in Saudi for this show that I did.
Which you got some press for in 2009.
Yep.
So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that was pretty well covered. That was an interesting. So we did this show. So I met up with this guy. People know him in Saudi now, but at the time when I met, I was on this interview with Al Arabiya, and the IT guy was my translator. The IT guy was this Ali Kelthami, and he and I were. We kind of got along like a house on fire. We started cracking jokes together. So we hung out like every day for like 2 or 3 years, and I brought him in and we started doing stand-up comedy stuff and started filming some of that with that. But part of that is I had gone to Rotana and said I want to make this film on documentary kind of about all the Saudi music scene, because there was really big at that time. There was this weird metal thing going on and all these other things that were happening. There was about, I think, 170 bands in Saudi, and I think 70 of them had recorded music, and then I think two of them had been signed. Anyway, it was a really so I sort of presented this idea to them, and then they said, "Oh, why don't we do some kind of docudrama type thing?" And so I just went to Ali and said, "Look, we got to do something with this. Let's just make up a script." So we started working on this thing called Almost, which was kind of this story about these 4 young Saudi guys who were in high school and losers, and they tried to always do stuff and fail every time they tried to do it. So the pilot episode was about this. They tried to be a rock band, and I remember we went out, and it was Ali's first time doing this stuff, and it was the first time for a lot of people. So we went out to the streets of Riyadh. We used to go to Dontahia, and we'd literally go inside restaurants or places or pull people off the street and say, you know what, because we created this, we drew up the 4 people that we wanted them to look like. One of them I remember the hardest guy to find was the guy we wanted to look like Superbad, Jonah, from Superbad. We finally found the Saudi equivalent of that. And we found him in a Johnny Rockets on Talia. But the casting calls, those were really funny because we had the first casting call, and actually Saudi golf casting got its start because of these guys came to me, so we want to start this casting company. So they went ahead and because we didn't have any money to do all this, so they got us we said we want to do it at a hotel, so they paid for the room, and we had about 150 people show up for this first casting. We used to do it all through Facebook. We would say we were looking for these types of people, come on down. And I remember when we did it, we had, I think 90 of them were guys maybe, and then the other 50 were girls or 60 were girls. And I remember everyone was kind of talking in the lobby. Well, they came to us, they said, listen, you guys, the girls have to go. We can't, because people were, there's too many people here, and the girls had to go. And so we finally said, okay, fine, we'll do it another day. They were all disappointed. But we went through all 90 of these people, and it was nuts. We were there for 5-6 hours and having everyone do an audition and filming it all. And then we ended up doing a second one, and people were excited because nothing like that. That's not the traditional way. There's no usually open casting calls here, so it was something new. I think it's still relatively, people really don't do it much. We just did it for Born a King, and I realized that we still have a ways to go for that. We definitely, there's a lot of development that still needs to happen, especially in casting in Saudi.
So what next for you as a storyteller? Is there another film on the horizon?
Yeah, there is. So I just came from LA, and I don't want to say too much about it, but I've got another film that I have a script that's optioned. That's a big story about. So Born a King tells the story of Faisal and this 13-year-old, but his father, King Abdulaziz. His story is pretty epic, right? I mean, it's legendary. It's
yes. It's
a bit of a Braveheart type film. So this is kind of the next story I'd like to tell. But I'd like to, of course, make sure that everyone that I'd like to shoot it here. So I'd like to make sure that the people that would care about that would make sure that they like the script and everything. But I've definitely got we're taking some steps forward down with that, and it's an exciting thing. So we're going to see how that goes.
Very good. Well, best of luck with that, and thank you for joining us here today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Best of luck with
KAUST.
Yeah, well, and best of luck with the screening.
Yeah.
And with again the festivals after that.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Yeah.
It's really good, and thanks to the team. I mean, KAUST has been very friendly, and Mary Laura, she's known her for a while now, and I'm really looking forward to kind of getting into this winter enrichment program. I think it's going to be fun.
Very good. Do we have any questions from the audience? We want to take a few questions.
Yeah, I will summarize one that we received online through the live Facebook broadcast. What aspects of Saudi Arabia most inspire you in your filmmaking? Are there particular sort of differences that you find in Saudi Arabia from other countries that you bring out in your filmmaking, for instance?
It's the people. I think that to me is the number one. I've seen, for me, some of the gentlest, kindest people I've ever met are here, and the hospitality and the way that the closeness of the people and the community and the family. I think it's a side that I think is inspiring, and I also think there is another thing that's there is a bit of a magic to me to Saudi. I don't know what it is, but I can't put my finger on it, but there's a feeling here that I think, I always attribute it back to kind of the days of sitting around and telling stories around a fire and developing that gift for sort of, because every year I go to the Rub al Khali and I spend about 5-6 days out there in the deep, deep desert, a place called Shelfa. And you see this canopy of stars and you realize that it's this blank canvas, and even the desert, the Rub al Khali means empty quarter. It's literally considered the most lifeless desert in the world. But there's a beauty to that blank canvas. It's almost, you have to fill it with something. And what you fill it with is your imagination. And I think that has come through to people. I think Saudis have done that for a long time. And, I think that I'm a believer that there's a lot of, it's like a cultural DNA, right? So I think that comes through, that there's a beauty to that and a magic to that, and an ability when you sit down with people in Saudi and they just like to just be there, and they don't need necessarily drinks or anything else, where you find they don't need these social lubricants. They kind of like, let's sit down, have coffee, and just chat. And it's this relaxed kind of approach where I feel there's so much that happens within that space, and the kind of relationships that are built in that, I think, are important. So I think a lot of that inspires me through the filmmaking. That, and I think that I love old stories of. I have a lot of friends that are Saudi, and I love hearing some of the tribal stories and some of the epic ways that. That's actually something else that I'm working on as well. There's this TV series that I'm writing right now with with a few other people, but it's sort of a cross. It's like a 310 to Yuma for Saudi. It's like a western, but in Saudi, a remake, and there's some jinn involved and some things like that. But a lot of it's kind of based off the tribal culture, because tribal culture is very fascinating. If you've never delved into it, you have to. And I don't think a lot of people talk about that here, but there's so many aspects to it. And I think there's a whole code and a lot of things that I think it's fascinating for the regular, and this would be something in English, this series. So I think people will really be interested to kind of get that aspect of how, what the code and how they interacted, the tribes, and a lot of that's still going on, but especially back in the day, I think is very interesting.
Do you have other questions?
The series sounds really interesting. Who's your target audience with it?
So a lot of my work is, I always try to make it universal. So my work, I feel, is always, and I hope you'll see this if you come to the screening tonight, or with any of my past work, it's both for Saudis but also for international audience, because I feel that that's important. So I really, in a way, I try to make it for Saudis first in the respect of like, I remember when I first came out here in 2009, sorry, 2007, back out here, but I was kind of a lot more familiar with Riyadh, and the commercials you'd watch would be like Lebanese people, and they'd be wearing the things wrong, and they'd be, I mean, nothing against Lebanese, it's just that's what the people that were in there, but there was all these representations of Saudis, especially in TV and other things like that weren't actually Saudis, and they were getting it wrong. And it used to really make me upset, because I would say, man, why aren't Saudi? And I know that maybe that sounds, so maybe that's another thing with me, is I'm not Saudi, and I may be telling some stories about Saudi. But what I am is I do care a lot about, I care deeply, I have good relationships with Saudis, and I work with them on what I do, so it's not Todd's version of, it's Saudi story, but it's also being told in a way that is it also considers international audiences as well. Because if you were completely Saudi-centric, I don't think it would have as much of a reach. So it's just like anything, you tweak the story to make it, not tweak it, but add to it to make it, and do it in a way, little things that will make it internationally appealing. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, good.
Anything else? Yeah, I think we're good.
Great.
All right. Well, that's all for now. Make sure and join us tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. We're going to be speaking with Fuad Musa from Sabic. It's at 9 a.m. It's going to be here live on the Facebook page. Thank you.